Picture this. You're walking your support dog, Danny, as usual. Everything's fine, it's raining, but you're not made out of sugar, so no big deal. Right? The storm unexpectedly gets stronger and drags Danny into your biggest nightmares, tight spaces, since you suffer from intense claustrophobia. The one thing you hold most dear needs your help in an environment that triggers almost unbearable amounts of panic and fear in you. You try to overcome your irrationality, enter the sewers, and confront your claustrophobia in order to search for Danny, almost as if someone wanted you to try exactly that. As we go further, we become increasingly more entangled with the surroundings and other lost individuals. Notes, references, symbolism, and a handful of different monsters are strewn about this nightmarish realm, each adding to the complexity of Lost in Vivo's story. Finding and puzzling everything together until you get a clear picture might be overwhelming, especially on the first playthrough. So let's try to make sense of everything we go through in this game and answer this question. What is the story of Lost in Vivo? The game starts with a rather one-sided therapy session. After seemingly stonewalling our therapist's attempts to help us, they suggest a more direct treatment called in vivo exposure therapy, which is a form of treatment focused on facing the source of trauma head-on. Our claustrophobia, being the pathological fear of staying in enclosed rooms, was debilitating enough to make us seek professional help. The identities of both us, the protagonist, and our therapist are elusive. Their names, ages, and genders are never revealed, and it will stay that way for the entirety of the game. How big of an impact this claustrophobia has on our life is shown in the Darkmode, a small additional campaign in which our only task is the usual drive home. Upbeat music is playing, and it seems like we're doing just fine. Up until the mood starts to shift. The sky darkens and the music stops, which might hint at the protagonist already knowing what's to come. A tunnel with "now leaving safety" written on a sign above. The meaning of this is obvious and is further amplified by the apparent anxiety attack we suffered during this section. Luckily, the exit is up ahead, and we get to leave the tunnel before succumbing to our claustrophobia. The sky brightens up and uplifting music starts playing again, emphasizing the relief we must feel right now. But this was only temporary, and a second, even longer tunnel is ahead of us. The environment around us transforms into a twisted mess of flesh and concrete. We again begin to hallucinate, and because this tunnel is even longer than the first one, the panic attack we're probably going through right now is much more intense. Upon reaching our home, a text in capital letters is shown. You made it home. This makes us feel like we've just accomplished something huge, like we've survived a fight of life and death. And evidently, that was exactly the case. If we hadn't kept pushing forward, we wouldn't have made it home. A fight for our life every single day. We're obviously not in control of our own life anymore. The claustrophobia controls us, and so the protagonist decided to seek professional help, which can be seen in the first of the 4 lost tapes. The lost tapes are little sub-scenarios, usually detached from the main story, with the exception of the first one. Out of the 4 tapes, this is the only one you don't find, but instead already possess from the start of the game. We apparently found it at home, which could allude to the notion that this tape actually connects to the events of the main game. We find ourselves in a very gruesomely depicted animal shelter from which we free Danny, our therapy dog. This entire section represents the day we finally, and reluctantly, seeked professional help. we initially did not want, but regardless had to accept external help, which could explain why taking such a big step in the right direction still felt uncomfortable. Going back to present day, and therefore to the actual main campaign, the game begins with us taking Danny for a walk, during which we find both an article on the ground and a missing person poster. Apparently, a woman named Jane Exspiravit has been missing since 2007. Keep her name and face in mind, as Jane will appear more often during the course of the game. The article is about some secret government experiments brought to the public by a so-called Dr. B. That should also be kept in mind. The rain gets heavier and thunder echoes in the distance, which is reminiscent of the game's description. The sky dropping down further every day. With each labored breath, your world is shrinking. The storm eventually drags Danny into the sewers, forcing us to descend into the narrow tunnel system and instantly being confronted with our biggest nightmares. This marks the start of the exposure therapy. One of the multiple ways the exposure therapy can be conducted is the so-called flooding, which involves the rapid exposure of feared situations to the patient. Seeing as we're currently confronting our claustrophobia head-on, this is probably the method we're using to undergo the therapy right now. The fact that this method is called flooding also may suggest that this introduction only serves as a metaphor for the start of the therapy, which is probably why the search for Danny turns out to be a lot more difficult than expected. Descending deeper into the sewer system, we come across the mad ramblings of a homeless man talking about some putrid creature asking for his eyes, a request that he obliged. And shortly after learning about him, we get to meet him. We're not alone down here, and we're apparently not welcome either. Shortly after this, we find Danny, but just before being able to grab her, she gets dragged away by an invisible force into a hole that we could probably fit in, but won't because we're too scared. An underground area with electricity and rooms that somewhat seem to even be made for housing, an eyeless hobo that just disappears if we avoid his encounter, and an invisible force dragging Danny away from us. What is this place? Continuing our search, we come across a room that might just answer this question. Here we can find 3 references to the book Dante's Inferno. In short, Dante's Inferno tells the story of Dante, who is being guided through the 9 circles of hell by the pure spirit and well-known poet Virgil in search for his true love Beatrice. The first reference being, "All hope abandon ye who enter here," written next to a sewer pipe, the only way to continue our journey. It's the slightly rephrased "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here," which is written above the gate to hell in Dante's journey. We can also find a stream of water, and next to it an oar with Charon inscripted on it, also referring to the book in which the ferryman Charon brings the dead across a river and into the 9 circles of hell. A calendar we can find later reveals the circle of hell we are about to enter. 7-2-V, meaning 7th circle, 2nd ring, violence. The 7th circle of hell, according to Dante's Inferno, is violence, which is divided into 3 rings, with those who committed violent actions against themselves, suicide for example, residing in the 2nd circle, the one which we are about to enter. A poster, also findable later, with the inscription "Violence versus Self," further amplifies this notion. We now, symbolically speaking, cross the river and enter the gates to hell, more specifically the 2nd ring of the circle of violence, in search of our true love, Danny. The stream of water could also again represent the flooding, as we now have to venture into the narrow sewage pipes. After crawling through them, we find a hole in the ground, and of course, descending further into whatever nightmare we are experiencing right now seems like a good idea. Continuing through the rusty sewer system, we come across imprisoned monsters, but no real danger. This might hint at our fear of tight spaces being unfounded, irrational. And just before reaching a silhouette that appears to be Danny, we find ourselves in the safe room, a place of peace. The safe room may represent our therapist's office, the statue of Virgil depicting the therapist themselves. Both are places of safety. And just as Virgil guides Dante through his hell, our therapist guides us through our own personal hell. Leaving the room, we feel a sense of relief. No more monsters, and no more rusty sewers. Instead, we find ourselves in a subway station, where, upon arriving at the platform, a train with Danny and Virgil on it departs without us. This is the 4th time Danny was taken away from us, and each time it happened, we descended deeper into the sewers, further confronting our claustrophobia in the process. Considering the fact that we're currently in hell and have already seen a fair amount of creatures that wouldn't be able to exist under normal circumstances, assuming Danny to be one of them wouldn't be too far-fetched. Maybe she isn't actually real, but rather symbolizes our will of being able to live without our crippling claustrophobia, our will to change for the better, which would also explain why she's prolonging our journey. Defeating our claustrophobia isn't going to be an easy or quick task, and the dark mode made it apparent that we're not able to live an ordinary life. This is deeply rooted in our mind. It's gonna take time. We've now established a little basis of where we are, what we're struggling with, and what some of the already existing characters may represent. But for now though, our story will be put on hold, and someone else takes the spotlight. Someone that's been missing for quite some time. Strewn about the subway system, Jane has left notes in which she has expressed her internal struggles. Our first, but Jane's final notes state that she just wants to stay in the dark, hidden from everyone's judgment. With her wanting to finally take control of her life back, she makes one last decision on her own, subsequently apologizing for the following. Suicide. This is further confirmed upon arriving at the next station, where a pair of shoes were intentionally left at the edge of the platform. What we do know about Jane so far is that the numerous billboards promoting dieting and weight loss tactics, as well as Jane's first 2 notes we were able to find, indicate that she's struggling with low self-esteem and maybe even an eating disorder. The previous train stopped in the middle of the tracks and we're stuck here at this station, but a note tells us how to fix this problem. We need to turn off the power in 3 different sections of the subway station. On our way to the first section, we can find a diaper changing table covered in blood in a woman's restroom, and another one of Jane's notes, which again highlights her low self-esteem. We can also find a note from one of the employees, which proves Jane's suicide to be real. After turning off the power, the section is shrouded in darkness, and we encounter our first real enemy, the Ghost Girl. The Ghost Girl appears as a disfigured woman with blood-smeared genitals, which can be linked to the diaper-changing table. In the employee's note, the last sentence in particular stands out. "I can't stop her, she passes through the walls," which refers to the Ghost Girl's behavior, meaning this is Jane's ghost. Additionally, Jane's last name, Exspiravit, is Latin and translates to ghost. The Ghost Girl's appearance is intentionally grotesque and contorted, since we're now seeing things more or less from Jane's perspective. She apparently saw herself just as ugly. We cannot kill her ghost. As long as we stay in the dark, she will always come back. But once we leave the darkness, she won't follow, as she just wants to stay in the dark, hidden from everyone's judgment. Shortly after this, another one of Jane's notes mentions someone who tries to talk her out of these negative thoughts and feelings. Someone who doesn't find her ugly. After turning off the power in all 3 sections and rebooting the system, we fixed the train malfunction and ensured a train ride to our next destination. Upon exiting the control room, however, we're unexpectedly greeted with this. We'll find out later what exactly just happened. Shortly afterwards, the train arrives, and we get on it through the only door that opens, right in front of Jane's shoes. We're already aware that this train ran over Jane back in 2007. It's now stained with blood. So instead of a metallic floor, the train has an organic, fleshy floor, and dead rats are scattered all over the place, possibly symbolizing Jane's and maybe even our feelings of disdain or discomfort. The mental links both of us have to this train are anything but positive. We can also find another one of Jane's notes, from which we can gather that said person, who previously had such a positive influence on her, now wants her to lose weight, further reinforcing Jane's distorted perception of herself. It definitely didn't do her any good. With the train ride abruptly coming to an end, we arrive at the Grand Bolam Avenue, which hints at bulimia, an eating disorder in which those affected suffer from a condition that causes them to eat excessive amounts of food with the fear of gaining weight, making them resort to vomiting, the so-called purging. Jane's underweight appearance and her distorted self-image already hint at her suffering from bulimia. Up next is a seemingly simple puzzle. The door to continue our journey is covered in some kind of slime and won't open. The room right next to it, however, contains a bottle of acid as well as a mirror. Simple enough. Well, a puddle causes us to slip, accidentally spilling the acid and killing ourselves. After respawning and re-entering the room, however, we're greeted with a new enemy, the mirror. Most likely emanating from Jane's psyche, the mirror represents the psychological distress she felt every time she saw herself in the mirror, again tying back to her self-hatred. The same could be said about the now broken mirror on the wall. Upon inspecting the remnants of our little accident, comments such as "I'm so ugly" and "nobody wants me" give us a glimpse of the negative thoughts that must have constantly cycled through Jane's mind. Speaking of Jane's mind, we now come across the subway tracks with a train blocking our path. It's a little off-center, however, and upon inspection, the protagonist proclaims that something about the train unnerves them. Rightfully so, because the train is alive. The ghost train's appearance might make sense considering Jane's cause of death. She must have felt just as helpless and petrified during her final moments as we do when the ghost train comes after us. Her final screams and the employee's note indicate the sheer panic and maybe even regrets she must have felt. In another woman's restroom, we can find another one of Jane's notes. She's pregnant, and she's not sure whether to be happy or sad about it. The multiple broken mirrors and a kitchen knife we can find in one of the bathroom stalls, coupled with blood-soaked toilet paper, however, indicate the latter. This is further reinforced by our encounter with the leeches. In her next note, Jane mentions her boyfriend threatening to leave her as her pregnancy is causing a significant weight gain, which leads to Jane referring to her unborn child as a parasite. She blames both herself and the baby for her boyfriend's abuse. The leeches might represent her hatred and disgust towards her unborn child. Eventually, we come across another safe room, but something isn't right. The normally calming music now pauses and distorts every couple seconds, and the safe orb is jittering unnaturally. Upon interacting with it, our save state isn't saved as usual, but deleted. Let's just hope nothing bad happens. This is Shoggoth. We can't escape, nor kill it. No matter how hard we try, our death is inevitable. Our safe state, all the progress we've made so far, is gone, and we can't do anything about it. We feel hopeless and desperate, just like Jane did after everything that she has worked so hard for until this point came crashing down on her. Her boyfriend leaving Jane during a time in which she needs him the most, a pregnancy that starts to become more and more unwanted, and her mental health problems now being more debilitating than ever all happen at once, making her feel like she has lost everything. Just like us. Immediately after our inevitable death, we get to see another therapy session. This time it's between a therapist and Jane. In it, her self-hatred and body dysmorphia are being addressed, and her therapist again prescribes her fluoxetine. Fluoxetine, more commonly referred to as Prozac, is an antidepressant used to treat a variety of mental illnesses, such as depression, OCD, and bulimia. The possible side effects of Prozac, however, include anxiety, insomnia, mood swings, and in particularly bad cases, increased symptoms of depression and suicidal thoughts, possibly leading to actual suicide attempts. Taking Prozac during pregnancy may increase the chances of experiencing sad side effects. In Jane's case, we can assume that the conjuncture of all the mentally and physically taxing events that happened in such a short span of time, as well as the side effects of the Prozac, led to her decision of ending her own life. We're now given a choice. We can continue to chase after a perfect, flawless, but impossible ideal of beauty, resulting in punishment and eventually death. Or we take the path of reality and acceptance. Taking this path, we're given supplies, and the concept of a flawless, beautiful woman on the right side loses its features and importance, whilst the reality on the left side progressively shines through Jane's twisted perception of herself, which reveals a familiar face. The next puzzle includes the way forward, an apple, and a toilet. We can also find 2 vending machines filled with rotten meat, and a broken mirror. Eating the apple will result in metallic bars blocking our way. This barrier, however, is only psychological and not physical. Jane's bulimia makes her falsely believe she physically cannot eat without purging. Continuing after you've intentionally vomited or starved yourself, you'll again be punished. Eating the apple and pushing through the mental barrier, however, will again reward us, and during the course of this puzzle, the mirror is slowly piecing itself back together, and the vending machine's contents will transform back into normal snacks. We're not seeing food as something disgusting and possibly dangerous anymore. Somehow, we're currently pushing through the majority of Jane's struggles. Her body dysmorphia, self-loathing, and even her bulimia. Her biggest internal struggle, however, still awaits. This is Jane's baby. The rats below it might again reflect Jane's disdain for her child. Whether we take, leave, or kill it doesn't matter and won't change anything in any important way, which shows once again how little Jane cares about her child's well-being. Shortly afterwards, this happens. We almost suffered the same fate as Jane in this realm, but her spirit saved us. A torn piece of Danny's leash can be found on the broken tracks, showing us we're on the right way. We're making progress. A final note from Jane can be found in the mines. She physically died years ago, however her spirit still resided in the subway station, staying hidden in the dark and fighting off everyone who got too close. Eventually, someone came along and worked through her problems as if they were their own, pushing Jane into the light and coming out victorious. That person was us, which is why the date of this note is always the day you're playing this part on. Jane is now free. It hurt at first and she fought back, but we've managed to help her. And now, she's returning the favor. The constant weight gain of her pregnancy has fueled her self-hatred, leading to Jane projecting that hate towards her unborn child, even going so far as to call it a parasite. After suffering from body dysmorphia for at least multiple months, constantly receiving psychological abuse from her boyfriend, unwantedly getting pregnant, starting treatment with Prozac, perhaps experiencing the worst of its possible side effects, only to be left all alone at the end with seemingly no one to reach out to for help, she eventually reached her breaking point, aborting the child in a public restroom by herself with a kitchen knife, which explains both her genital area and the bloodied bathroom stall. But now, her nightmare is over. She can finally move on to the afterlife. Jane's nightmare may be over, but we're not done yet. The next individual that we more or less get to know is the so-called paranoid man. As his name already implies, he doesn't reveal much information about himself, not even his name or age. What we can gather from the 3 notes he left scattered around the mines is that the monsters up above, as he puts it, caused him to retreat and seek shelter in these mines, that he can't trust anyone but himself. Venturing through the mines, we come across a locked, ominous door. In order to open it, we need to find 3 emblems, and while doing so, we suddenly stumble upon Danny. I don't think she's doing too good. At this point, a pattern seems to be forming. In order to advance in the subway system, we had to turn off the lights 3 times while being chased by an unkillable ghost that physically represented 2 of Jane's biggest struggles, her bulimia and body dysmorphia. In order to advance in the mines, we need to find 3 emblems while being chased by yet another unkillable ghost, seeing as it also passes through the walls once temporarily downed and reappears whenever it pleases to. The dog mimic, a monster with sinister intent, disguising as our beloved dog, may embody the paranoid man's trust issues. But unlike Jane's ghost, who was able to accept our help, finally leaving the past behind and moving on, there is no such closure for the paranoid man. We've already established that he may suffer from severe trust issues, so maybe we couldn't get through to him. Keep in mind, we never actually learn anything of substance about his past or current situation. Jane fought back, but ultimately accepted our help. The paranoid man only fought back, with the dog mimic just disappearing once we enter the ominous door. Speaking of which, welcome to Nizumi Testing. Nizumi Testing is a vile place. It seems sterile and clean on the surface, but digging just a bit deeper reveals its true purpose. The name itself, Nizumi, is Japanese and means rat, and combining the underlined parts of Nizumi Testing leaves us with nesting, both strongly foreshadowing the abundance of dead and mutated rats. The paranoia of being watched and followed remain prominent throughout this entire section, with cameras all over the place, doors opening and closing, and faint footsteps. This could further allude to the notion that this laboratory somehow correlates to the paranoid man's story. Maybe the atrocities that take place here are his conjecture of what else these monsters up above are capable of. Considering the isolation he put himself in, he undoubtedly had enough time on his hands to let his thoughts run wild. And with no one to talk him out of his delusional perception of humanity, is it any wonder why it's portrayed so cruel, so devoid of empathy? Venturing through the lab, we come across the personal archives of 2 scientists, Dr. Piccinini and Dr. Brundle, who was already mentioned at the start of the game, only being referred to as Dr. B. They oppose each other like night and day. While Dr. Piccinini seems like a lunatic who, instead of tending to the already gruesome experiments, in secret works on his own, even more horrifying goals, Dr. Brundle represents a voice of reason, distancing himself not only from Dr. Piccinini and his goals, but also from the lab's experiments themselves, even blowing the whistle and informing the public about it. In relation to the paranoid man, these 2 scientists could be an allegory for his mind, which is slowly but surely being consumed by the insanity of living in solitude and absolute silence, while still maintaining a certain amount of rationality and reason, which possibly breaks for good in this very moment. As afterwards, the lab is overrun with monsters. These are called Ratman. A note from Dr. Brundle hints at his former colleagues becoming these Ratman as a result of worshipping Dr. Piccinini's pet project. Maybe that's how the paranoid man views other humans, as cunning rats. And of course, they only overtake the place once his final bit of sanity shatters. But perhaps the correlation between this laboratory and the paranoid man seems too far-fetched. Considering the public newspaper article at the beginning of the game, which mentions both the experiments and Dr. Brundle, one could also suggest that this actually happened in the real world. Perhaps some of these failed experiments broke out of the lab, causing havoc on the surface. This would make the reason for the paranoid man's retreat a physical threat and not a psychological one. Maybe the monsters up above are in fact monsters, and not normal humans he just views as monsters. The fact that Dr. Brundle, the supposed rational side, seemingly made it out alive, while Dr. Piccinini, the supposed insanity that took over the paranoid man's mind, can be found dead, could even contradict this theory, so maybe I'm totally missing the mark here. Meanwhile, venturing through a lab in which cruel experiments are being conducted on animals, we worry more than ever about Danny's safety. Let's hope we find her soon. A brief moment of relief. The sole reason we fought our way through everything that we've been through until this point is now directly in front of us. But as sudden as Danny emerged, she submerges just as quickly. We flood the room we're in, which could again hint at our exposure therapy, and is quite fitting considering that after several attempts, despite the protagonist's refusal, we have the option to go after Danny and enter the narrow sewage pipes. Regardless of which path we choose, we end up here in the Nezumi testing warehouse, where we encounter Dr. Piccinini's pet project. This is Sotiris. Even though he's often the center of Lost in Vivo, Sotiris doesn't appear to have any important meaning to our or the paranoid man's story. Getting killed by it though leaves us with a pretty neat death scene. With Sotiris being Greek and translating to savior, him being called savior of rats later in the game, and the scientists of Nezumi testing worshipping Sotiris, subsequently mutating into the Ratman, we can safely assume all this to be connected. Sotiris was also the creature that took the hobo's eyes at the beginning of the game, but why is still beyond comprehension, for me at least. Seriously, I don't have any answers for Sotiris' story and everything related to him. I originally planned on skimming over Sotiris entirely, but thought it was still worth mentioning. You may have noticed already, but I had my difficulties coming up with plausible theories for this section. Maybe a helpful soul out there is willing to provide some answers, or plausible theories. Leaving the warehouse, we enter an elevator, which slowly but surely ascends to the surface. The credits start rolling, and all we can do is wait for the end. The nightmare is over, right? The elevator descends back down. We succumb to our claustrophobia because of the confined elevator and suffer another panic attack, the worst one so far, even vomiting and hallucinating. Maybe the sheer terror we're feeling right now means the protagonist, again, already knows what's to come. The nightmare, our nightmare, is far from done. This is only the beginning. Instead of being confronted with the problems of other people, it's now our turn. Before that, however, we get the opportunity to explore a small part of an apartment, presumably ours. Here we can find a familiar note, however the last sentence has been altered. Quitting has been replaced with giving up. Not seeing any substantial progress after everything we've pushed through probably made us feel like throwing in the towel. So, time to finally take control back. We are now presented with 3 doors. Behind the first, we find some sort of arena with an electrifiable pool of water and the so-called talking brain, our subconscious.
What are you hoping to accomplish? Without me, you're just hollow. You're pathetic. You need fear to motivate you.
Seems like we too suffer from low self-esteem caused by our mental health issues. The fact that its voice is male is particularly interesting. Could this reveal our agenda, giving us at least some information about our identity? Or could this be the voice of someone we know? Someone trying to bring us down? Maybe an abusive boyfriend? Whatever the case may be, deep inside, we know this voice is trying to manipulate us. So we destroy the talking brain, and shortly after realize why this arena even exists. This is the Siren, which is symbolic of our claustrophobia. A huge, seemingly unkillable monster. The remedy we've used against all the other enemies we've encountered so far doesn't seem to work on this one. We can't even temporarily down it with conventional means, unlike the manifestations of Jane's and the paranoid man's issues. It's almost reminiscent of our encounter with Shoggoth, which felt just as hopeless. But unlike that encounter, we actually have a chance this time, as just before confronting the talking brain, we can find a poem which tells us how we can defeat the Siren. Acting upon this advice, we're able to achieve the first big milestone in our therapy. A calming sense of relief showers us. We're not done yet, but for now, we won. As mentioned at the beginning of the video, Virgil was a well-known poet, meaning the poem was probably left behind by him. With Virgil not only initiating the fight by summoning the Siren, but also aiding us at the same time, we can assume this to be a metaphor for them conducting the exposure therapy. Our therapist making us confront our claustrophobia head-on while still providing guidance and support. Behind the second door, we again encounter the talking brain, but this time our thoughts seem less condescending.
Do you think you're getting better? Does doing this even have a purpose?
We didn't listen to this negative, hateful part of our mind the first time, so instead of doubting ourselves, we begin to doubt the therapy and its effectiveness. We're subconsciously fighting the idea of confronting our claustrophobia and still suffering from its devastating effects, even after everything we've been through until now probably made us question what we're actually doing to progress. But neither questioning ourselves nor our therapist will get us any closer to being able to live without any mental barricades. We have to keep going. We're now controlling Danny in what seems to be the sewers from the beginning of the game. Following the whistles of our owner, we eventually reach a door and are abruptly thrown back into the protagonist's perspective. Something behind the door is frantically trying to get in, and if we open it, this happens. It again almost seems hopeless, but another one of Virgil's poems tells us once more how we can defeat the Siren. Acting upon this advice, we flood the room and get rid of it. This short section poses an interesting duality, our best friend and worst nightmare. Guiding Danny to us, our end goal of the therapy, only to realize that it's yet again the Siren we encounter. They're ultimately both a part of us, with one being a nuisance that we're desperately trying to get rid of, while the other is a goal that we're ambitiously trying to reach. Behind the third and last door, we encounter yet again the talking brain, which at this stage seems desperate in its attempt to bring us down.
I'm your identity. I'm your crutch. You used to cling to me like a parasite. I know you better than anyone, and I know you're weak. You'll come right back.
We've doubted ourselves, then the therapy, and now our dark side is doubting itself, desperately trying to berate us. The fact that its health steadily declines with each encounter further emphasizes how we're getting stronger and more committed. We're not letting our claustrophobia control us anymore. We're fighting back. We've been successful with helping Jane and failed in our attempt to help the paranoid man. Now it's up to us to choose our fate, and the answer seems obvious. Once again using Virgil's advice, we're able to finally defeat the Siren for good. What we're left with at the end is this. This thing called childhood memories symbolizes the traumatic experience during our childhood that led to the development of our claustrophobia. It shares many physical and behavioral similarities with the siren, but it's much smaller, slower, and weaker. Now that we've underwent the therapy and conquered our biggest fears, this huge monster reveals its true form, with its original manifestation merely being an exaggeration. Whether we kill or leave the childhood memories to fester doesn't matter. We are done here. Additionally, we can also find the so-called maggot coffin in this layer, which summarizes the events of the game up to this point. Jane, a girl lost in her body dysmorphia, the paranoid man, a boy lost in his twisted mind and paranoia, and the protagonist, another lost soul, watching them. They followed down the 7th of hell and fought their own fears in the second ring in the guise of finding their pet most dear. That pretty much sums up the game's story so far, which is slowly but surely coming to an end, and a choice we're presented with will determine how it ends. We can continue to follow Danny's barks and again throw ourselves deeper into our personal hell, or we take the opportunity to end this nightmare once and for all and leave the sewers. If we're soulless enough to do so, we reach the surface alone. The mood is depressing. We are free, but Danny isn't. In this ending, we've tried to confront our claustrophobia but couldn't bear it until the end. We had to stop just before we would have completed the therapy. Our claustrophobia still remains. If we, however, follow Danny's barking, we venture through the final area of the game. After getting the last couple enemies thrown at us, we eventually walk towards a light at the end of the tunnel. We made it. After leaving the sewers, we're finally reunited with Danny. The mood is completely opposite from the previous ending. Our world doesn't feel so small anymore. No rain, no sky dropping down on us. In this ending, we were able to defeat our claustrophobia, successfully undergoing the exposure therapy and reaching the goal of finding our pet most dear. We've been to hell and back, confronted our fears, and came out victorious. One character I've purposely skimmed over until now is Bayagototh, because he doesn't seem to actually be involved in the main story. Bayagototh appears as a seemingly alive tree with a piece of protruding meat. As mentioned, according to Dante's Inferno, people who commit suicide end up in the second ring of the circle of violence. It is unjust that a soul possessed what it deprived itself of in life, which is why, as punishment, their souls are transformed into cursed trees and their lifeless bodies are thrown onto their branches, functioning as a sick reminder of what they rejected, which explains the existence and origin of the last note we find, presumably written by Bayagototh. In the Nizumi testing lab, we can find a note analyzing the third lost tape, which in this note is referred to as Cast 3. The note's author appears to be someone called Dr. GLA, which is an acronym for Generic Lab Assistant. GLAs are the employees of GL Labs, the mysterious laboratory responsible for containing, classifying, and conducting tests on various anomalies, the so-called specimen in another one of Akumakira's games, Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion. Lost Tape 3 tells the story of a starving family. They prayed to Bayagototh for food, and he granted their wish, creating trees made out of flesh as an infinite supply of food. But as compensation, Bayagototh took their son and turned him into a demigod, now known as Specimen 8. Paintings of Specimen 8 can be found in the maintenance tunnels and the laboratory. Both Specimen 8, as well as the wolf from the Lost Tape 5, are children of Bayagototh. The tapes are both set in the same location, with Lost Tape 3 taking place prior to the events of the fifth one. The note also states that Cas3's spectrograms do not show its actual audio waves, but American wildlife and trees, which makes sense considering all the children of Bayagototh being animals, and Bayagototh itself being a tree, providing trees of flesh as a food source for his worshippers in dire need. The final bit of information this note gives us is that some of the researchers became obsessed with Bayagototh after a significant time of listening to the tape, some even being hospitalized. So again, maybe the events that took place in Izumi testing were in fact real, and this note reveals the reason, or at least part of it, as to why Dr. Piccinini and some of his fellow colleagues went insane. Speaking of Dr. Piccinini, carrying his corpse to Zatiris, taking the skull of a child from the siren, and offering this skull to Bayagototh as a sacrifice shortly before the end of the game will unlock the nightmare ending. There's no rain, no sun, and no Danny. Sirens can be heard in the distance, and a thick, hellish fog seems to restrict our view. We've either caused the end of the world, or entered some kind of upside-down reality, a contorted version of the world we used to know. The unnaturally thick layer of clouds and the enormous membrane dripping out of them enclose and suffocate the landscape around us, possibly another allegory for our claustrophobia. Unfortunately, Bayagototh's motives, as of now, remain unclear, but it's safe to say that his intentions are selfish and malicious. Apart from the main story and side characters, the game has a plethora of additional content to offer, aside from a couple Easter eggs. Turning your gamma all the way down and starting a new game will unlock the Darkmode, which we've already talked about. On the flip side, turning your gamma all the way up and starting a new game will grant you access to the Gallery of Light, which showcases all the entities encountered throughout the game. This gives you the opportunity to fully appreciate the love and effort that was put into the design of the monsters. But best of all, you can pet Danny as much as you want. Launching the game at 12 to 1 AM will boot an entirely different game, the Midnight Mode, a dungeon crawler that later got a spiritual successor called Lunacid. You can even find the game case of Midnight Mode in the main campaign, which is pretty neat, if you ask me. You're given a sword right at the start and have to fight your way through hordes of enemies, with your goal here being to defeat Shoggoth, or, for the ones with a keen eye, Bayagototh. By the way, both versions of Shoggoth were created as a memorial to Akuma Kira's pet snowflake eel that unfortunately passed away in 2018, so rest easy. You served an influence on a great work of passion, and your contribution will not be forgotten. Findable throughout the game are the lost tapes that put you into alternative, bite-sized scenarios with a very special, janky aesthetic. Akin to this style, except a bit longer, are the Mercis tapes. Apart from the first one, none of the tapes are related to the main story. There's also a secret ending. If you try desperately enough to leave the sewers right after entering them, or, even worse, shoot Danny's silhouette just before reaching the first safe room, you end up quitting the therapy prematurely, completely rejecting your journey. With your claustrophobia only having grown stronger from this brief experience, this is arguably the worst ending you can get. Obviously, who shoots their own dog? And lastly, there is a New Game Plus, which spices up the gameplay by introducing new enemies, such as the Crispies, with their most devastating attack being the obliteration of your eardrums, and even Jane's baby. It's fun. You're allowed to keep your entire arsenal, excluding all the ammo from your previous playthroughs. With each consecutive playthrough, the difficulty increases, enemies hit harder and more relentless. It's challenging, but certainly not impossible. All of this grants Lost in Vivo replayability, and even after 15 playthroughs and about 50 hours I've sunk into this game, I still regularly find new things I hadn't noticed prior. I messaged Akuma Kira, the developer, a while back, asking them some of my burning questions, and they were extremely helpful, with their responses being very extensive and respectful. So thank you, I appreciate you taking the time. Lost in Vivo is a carefully crafted work of passion, and even though I just talked about the game and its story for the past 50 minutes, by the way, thank you so much if you're still watching, I highly recommend playing this masterpiece yourself. By using certain sound effects and the soundtrack of the game in this video, I tried to convey Lost in Vivo's atmosphere as aptly as possible, but I believe you'll only be able to fully appreciate the game once you experience it yourself. Maybe you'll notice something I still haven't. Maybe you'll come to another conclusion regarding the characters. The game makes you question what you see, mostly without giving you straight answers, and that's what I love about it. Lost in Vivo gives you the opportunity to piece the story together at your own will, giving you just enough answers to not be left completely in the dark, while still leaving room for interpretation, which is the key word for this video. As mentioned, I tried my best to make sense of everything we went through in this game, but bear in mind, this is just my take on the story. I could still be completely missing the mark here. As Akuma Kira once said, the interpretation, of course, is up to you.
Do you think you're getting better? Does doing this even have a purpose? What are you hoping to accomplish? Without me, you're just hollow. You're pathetic. You need fear to motivate you. I'm your identity. I'm your crutch. You used to cling to me like a parasite. I know you better than anyone, and I know you're weak. You'll come right back.